friend to a terminally ill patient can carry on practicing. Good evening. The leaders of Europe gathered on the opening day of their summit in Edinburgh are reported to be close to agreement on concessions to Denmark that would enable it to ratify the Maastricht Treaty on closer European Union. The Danes rejected the treaty in a referendum in June, and their Prime Minister said today the summit was the last opportunity for a deal his countrymen could accept. The concessions would allow Denmark to opt out of several of the most important provisions of the treaty. They could still be blocked by the poorer countries of the EC as part of their campaign for more money from the European budget.
The summit leaders know the historic setting of Holyrood Palace is meant to inspire them to new political consensus, charting the community's course away from months of damaging division. The Danish Prime Minister Poul Schlüter is telling his own people they must back any deal done here or face leaving the EC. John Major is keeping his fingers crossed, needing success from this summit. But success depends on agreement with powerful champions of Maastricht. The French President François Mitterrand has German backing to limit concessions to the Danes and to keep up the pressure on them and the British to ratify fast. Britain says a deal on Denmark is not yet done.
Well, we're not there. We're not there because there were some criticisms again of our text. Everybody said it's very ingenious, it's very intelligent, the British have done very well, but we just need this little change, that little clarification.
Signing the visitors' book at Edinburgh Castle, the Federalists are suspicious giving their name to any document entitled Decision on Denmark at this summit could undermine the Maastricht Treaty. So discussion today got bogged down with lawyers assuring the heads of government there's no danger of that. So the British presidency, bringing the 12 leaders together for the family photograph, is edging them closer to a way forward for Denmark. France is now saying progress has been made on 80% of the issue, but Danish No campaigners are in Edinburgh too, hoping to spoil the party, saying they're only being offered Maastricht all over again.
It'll be rejected in the next second Danish referendum. And it'll be rejected in the third referendum and the fourth referendum and the fifth referendum. We'll continue to reject the proposals as long as they do not amend the treaty.
Denmark's Prime Minister insists he will get a genuinely new package, and tonight gave the strongest indication yet a deal will be done tomorrow, that real progress has been made.
I certainly think we have. We are after a double result. One, a binding solution which is satisfactory to Denmark, and on the other side a solution which does not necessitate new ratification processes in the other countries. It's a bit difficult, but there's a lot of goodwill. I'm not sure, almost sure that we shall receive the final result tomorrow afternoon.
Certainly all the leaders need a summit solution to start a repair job on a divided community. That's the most powerful incentive to settle.
But there seems to have been little progress on securing a deal on EC spending, one of the most divisive issues under discussion at the summit. The poorer EC countries, Spain, Portugal, Greece and Ireland, are taking a tough line to try to ensure they get more money from the richer members.
EC leaders were split as they opened discussions today on the future financing of the community. Poorer countries criticised British plans for meeting the community's bills as niggardly. But John Major hopes to salvage the much criticised British presidency with an economic growth package.
The finance ministers will be discussing that this morning. The heads of government will discuss it over lunch. The finance ministers, in the light of what the heads say over lunch, will continue their discussions. I very much hope we can reach an agreement.
At the end of the day, his Chancellor was hopeful too.
I think it will be something that will give priority to investment and small businesses in Europe, and I think it'll be an extremely sensible package.
Officials are working overnight on the plan to be slipped under the doors of summit leaders early in the morning. Leaders are agreed on the need for action, but it won't help them agree on how the EC pays its own bills. The Spaniards, who are leading the separate drive by the poorer countries for the development fund promised by the Maastricht Treaty to be a generous one, are threatening that other deals are contingent on their satisfaction.
We think that this summit is very important. And this summit, there are four main questions: the ratification, the budget, subsidiarity and enlargement. And the four questions are interrelated. We would like to solve the four of them.
With demonstrators against job cuts out on Edinburgh streets today, the economic growth package could prove crucial in meeting Mr Major's wish to demonstrate the relevance of the Edinburgh proceedings to the real concerns of the people of Europe. The future finance row, meantime, was postponed until tomorrow as the summit leaders went off to dine with the Queen aboard the Royal Yacht Britannia, a social, not a political occasion.
Well, I'm joined now from Edinburgh by our political editor Robin Oakley and our foreign affairs editor John Simpson. John, you first. All the effort's been going into solving the Danish problems, but Britain has its own problems over ratification. How much pressure is Britain under, spoken or unspoken, to get on with it?
Well, I think it depends really what you mean by pressure. There's not a hostile pressure, as far as I can understand. The German spokesman was quoted in some of the agency reports as sounding pretty hostile earlier today, but when we spoke to him, he in fact wasn't being hostile at all. He said he understood perfectly well, and the German government understood perfectly well, the British problems with Parliament and the fact that you can't simply stampede the British Parliament into taking a quick vote on the thing. It's actually been one of the features of this that the British have put a great deal of effort into explaining Westminster's ways of doing things. So I didn't and don't get the impression there's an enormous pressure. I do get the impression that everybody wants to get on with it, and that if and when the Danes ratify the thing, then there will be a certain amount of impatience with Britain if we don't get on with it.
You've been to many of these events. There's always lots of rhetoric. There's always lots of taking up bargaining positions. What sense do you get tonight of movement, of some at least of these problems being resolved?
Well, I think it is lurching, really, towards its end. It seems, from what the French say, that the Danish issue, for instance, is 80% settled. That's really the way they like it, you know, at these things. They like to solve parts of the thing and then leave the rest tantalizingly for the second day. My guess is that we'll be brought right up to the line, that the whole thing will overflow well beyond the time that it was supposed to finish tomorrow, and that everybody will then claim it as a success. That's my guess, at any rate. And I suspect, frankly, this is why Britain has been stressing the problems of it, because after all, if John Major does succeed, that will only make the success seem greater.
Robin Oakley, the Danes are now talking about ratifying the Maastricht Treaty in the spring and hoping that Britain will do it by midsummer. Is that realistic?
Well, there is talk here tonight that the Danes are going to spring something of a surprise and have their second referendum as early as April. And the intriguing thing about that for John Major is that his own rebels, to whom he gave the promise that the House of Commons would not have a third reading of the bill until after a second Danish referendum, which was then expected in May, have been harrying him to say that the timing would be after the referendum, in the expectation that referendum might have slipped to September. If it now comes earlier, Mr Major might actually be able to get on rather faster with the bill in the House of Commons and actually have that third reading perhaps on the 1st of May or even earlier, if he says that he's tied by the Danish timing rather than by the month of May.
One issue that must worry John Major are the demands to revoke Britain's budget rebate. Has that come up yet?
Well, that's the dog that didn't bark in the night so far, but they only got round to the question of future financing, paying the community's own bills, this afternoon in their post-lunch session. Really it comes under that heading. If anybody wants to raise the question of the British rebate, and it does seem to be 11-1 on that particular issue, with everybody else saying they'd like to cut back on the British rebate, they will have a chance to do so tomorrow when the future financing discussions come about. But it does seem to be becoming a slightly more mellow affair than we'd expected this summit, as John Simpson has said, and maybe that row won't actually happen at all.
Robin Oakley, John Simpson, thanks very much. Lower mortgage rates have brought the inflation rate down to its lowest level for 6 years. The rise in retail prices in the 12 months to November was just 3%, down 0.6 on the previous month. It's expected to fall further in the next few months before rising again because of devaluation.
Cuts in mortgage rates, which followed the pound's exit from the exchange rate mechanism, were the main reason for the sharp drop in inflation last month. And with more recent mortgage cuts still to come through over the next 2 months, inflation's certain to fall even further in the new year. Inflation's come down steadily from over 4% just after the budget to today's 6-year low. The underlying rate, which excludes changes in mortgage rates, has followed it down and is now well below the government's 4% ceiling. Both measures are expected to dip lower in the next few months, But by the end of next year, inflationary pressures could take inflation back outside the target range. That's due to the fall in the value of the pound, which is already hitting companies like Tate and Lyle. It's having to pay much more for imported sugar. As a result, it's just raised its prices to food manufacturers and says it's only a matter of time before it feeds through into the shops.
I think very little of it has worked its way through at the present time. For example, there has been no increase in the price of sugar in shops at the moment, despite the fact that we have increased prices by almost 6 pence a kilo. So I don't think the retailers can hold off increasing prices for very much longer.
Ford, which raised car prices earlier this week, blamed the falling pound. Rover announced price increases today, again partly due to sterling's decline. It's a tendency that's reinforcing the government's caution over further interest rate cuts.
We've seen significant cuts in interest rates, and we have to be careful in setting our monetary policy about the inflationary pressures, particularly that of the devaluation of sterling, which of course isn't reflected in these figures.
The government should have an employment action programme and a policy for industry, because unless industry is rebuilt, and that needs government action, we'll slip into rising inflation again.
The immediate prospect, however, is encouraging. Fresh food prices haven't gone up as they usually do in winter, and the recession has so depressed the world oil market that a fresh petrol price war has broken out. Shell tonight announced an 18 pence a gallon price cut, claiming it's the biggest drop ever. But keeping inflation low in a recession is the easy bit. If a recovery starts, retailers may be more willing to pass on higher costs. Even with low inflation, the Chancellor remains cautious about cutting interest rates, and most outside economists expect inflation to be higher in a year's time than it is now.
The Russian Congress of People's Deputies has voted to ban President Yeltsin from calling a referendum on whether he or the Congress should be the country's supreme authority. The president had been counting on a national vote of confidence in his reform programme. Congress leaders will meet the president tomorrow in an attempt to resolve the crisis.
Rival political factions have been taking to the streets today, but both Mr. Yeltsin and his opponents in the Congress have appealed for calm. Despite the constitutional crisis here, they called on all Russians to avoid doing anything that could lead to confrontation or violence. Moscow's police, though, were out in force around the Kremlin, just in case. Today it was Parliament's turn to raise the political temperature. It voted to ban the referendum Mr. Yeltsin wants on who rules Russia. By a large majority, deputies amended the law so that such a referendum would be illegal, but Mr. Yeltsin's advisers took it calmly.
I prefer not to dramatize this fact. I don't think that it will affect the negotiations we have now between two branches of the government.
Those negotiations took place tonight between the chairman of the parliament, Ruslan Khasbalatov, and Mr. Yeltsin. The two antagonists agreed to set up a working party for further talks, and a joint communiqué was read out to the Congress, signed by both men, saying they would resolve their power struggle within the constitution. Not everyone seemed convinced about the prospects for peace, but tonight Mr. Yeltsin said he was ready to give it a chance.
We'll start talking about the details of a compromise at 11 o'clock tomorrow morning. And to avoid any more irritating decisions by Congress, it will not sit tomorrow.
The tension here that came from talk of a constitutional coup has now eased, and both sides in this crisis, both Parliament and President, have shown that they are ready to bargain and to compromise. One possible deal is that Mr. Yeltsin would sacrifice his controversial chief advisor, Gennady Burbulis, seen here on the right. In return, Parliament would allow Russia's radical young Prime Minister, Yegor Gaidar, on the left, to stay on for at least 6 months. He's crucial to Mr. Yeltsin's economic reform programme. This evening, thousands of the president's supporters marched through Moscow in an attempt to show the world that the Russian people back him in this crisis, not the Congress. Boris Yeltsin is still probably Russia's most popular politician. It's that mandate from the people that's given him the confidence this week to challenge those who continue to oppose his reforms. Ben Brown, BBC News, Moscow.
Serbs and Muslims have been reinforcing their front lines around the Bosnian capital Sarajevo. It looks as if both sides are preparing for decisive battles near the city before winter takes hold. Meanwhile, the work of delivering aid under fire continues for British soldiers.
These are hard and even uncertain times in central Bosnia, involving even the British UN troops who are intended to bring stability. They are unloading aid packages for an orphanage at Travnik. And then... No casualties, no damage, but it was a reminder of how close and dangerous the front line is. The peacemaking tonight was done in fact by 500 Italian campaigners who succeeded amid incredible dangers in crossing two front lines and a minefield into Sarajevo. They are aiming to succeed where the politicians have failed.
There should be a possibility to save people in Sarajevo and not just wait that the blood of Sarajevo will run out until everybody is dead and there is no lone living soul, just soldiers there. What are we waiting for?
The government of what remains of Bosnia isn't waiting for anything but reinforcing its troops on a mountain to the west of Sarajevo. President Alija IZETBEGOVIC, so often besieged inside his capital, is now above it with his commanders. But can they lift the siege?
We hope so. We are working every day for that. We are living for that.
Things are desperate for the forces of the Bosnian presidency. Two attempts to break out of Sarajevo from the inside have failed. Nothing remains as winter approaches but to break in from the outside. Martin Bell, BBC News, Kosiljak, Bosnia.
The United Nations Security Council is meeting tonight to decide whether to send a peacekeeping force to the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia. It's thought 700 troops are likely to be dispatched. There hasn't yet been fighting in Macedonia, but it shares a border with Serbia and Kosovo, where serious trouble is expected. If that happens, there are fears that neighbouring countries such as Greece and Albania could then become involved in the conflict.
It was only last week that United Nations officers visited the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia to assess the risk. The Republic's President, Kiro Gligorov, told them he feared being sucked into the fighting, a fear shared worldwide and now being acted on. Macedonia not only has an ethnic mix that could turn it into another Bosnia, it also has neighbours with claims on its territory and its people, the key that could turn the Yugoslav war into a wider Balkan one. It's why Macedonia's border with Serbia is set to become the first frontier to be patrolled by the UN before a conflict rather than after it. It's a new approach of prevention rather than cure, and it's welcomed by those who may eventually have to implement it.
The notion of trying to head off conflict by deploying forces in advance or by deploying observers into a particular area, or UN blue-helmeted peacekeepers might well make sense.
It's a view sharpened by events in Bosnia and the failure of the international community to do anything other than provide aid. Though Mr. Cheney ruled out American intervention on the ground, he didn't rule out airstrikes. NATO's Secretary-General confirmed that the mood within the alliance was hardening, and he personally wants to see a tougher response.
Very serious signals to the aggressors down there that if they continue, they risk military intervention. I would wish the United Nations to be very forceful now.
And do you think there is a growing consensus in favor of doing that?
I would not speak of a consensus, but I think the consensus is slowly building up.
For the moment, though, the focus is on tonight's vote at the UN in New York. Having missed the chance to stop the war, the UN may at least succeed in stopping it from spreading.
The two main warlords in Somalia have agreed a ceasefire and appealed to all Somalis to end hostilities, and they've agreed to order their forces out of the capital, Mogadishu. Gunmen are also beginning to leave Baidoa before American troops enter the town.
Though a stream of diplomats have been nudging the two men together, the American officials here had the muscle to give the final push. General Aidid and Mr. Ali Mahdi last met just over a year ago. In the meantime, their forces fought across a divided city, leaving tens of thousands dead or injured. There have been ceasefires before, but the fighting's gone on. If this reconciliation is genuine, it'll do more to help the famine victims than all the food aid put together. In Baidoa, the heart of the famine zone, about 90 people are still dying each day, a figure that's crept up recently. Even so, many of the agencies have pulled out their aid workers because of an increase in lawlessness. At Isha Hospital, the vast majority of patients are those suffering from bullet wounds. Dealing with this will be the Marines' priority.
Looking forward to the war surgery practice to take a marked decline once the Americans get here, if they ever get here. We've been waiting now for 3 or 4 days. They keep saying they're coming, kind of like the checks in the mail.
There were injured on the USS Tripoli too. But these were victims of last night's roadblock shooting. Officials admitted today that US Marines as well as French legionnaires opened fire on what everybody now accepts was an unarmed vehicle.
I think last night's incident has raised a number of worrying issues. One way to avoid an occurrence of this and any ill feeling on the part of Somalis and the international community might be that an independent observer group to whom the international community, the US forces, would be accountable to, and a group to whom the Somalis themselves may complain.
Part of the problem is a confusion over the rules of engagement. This is meant to be a humanitarian exercise, and it must concern the UN if military standards are applied regardless. George Alagaya, BBC News, Mogadishu.
Liquidators trying to recover funds lost in the BCCI affair have filed a suit for $10.5 billion against a Saudi bank and one of its directors. The National Commercial Bank of Saudi Arabia is the country's largest, and it's the one used by the Saudi royal family.
When the Bank of England closed down BCCI 18 months ago, it soon emerged that the biggest scandal in banking history had left behind liabilities of about $10 billion. The suits filed by the liquidators last night are the most significant efforts so far to recoup the losses. The National Commercial Bank of Saudi Arabia is controlled by the family of Sheikh Khalid bin Mahfouz. The liquidators allege that the Sheikh used his bank illegally to acquire a stake in BCCI and in an associated bank in America. The liquidators have already filed suits for $8 billion each against Pricewaterhouse and Ernst & Winnie, the accounting firms which acted as auditors for BCCI during its 19-year history. If all these lawsuits were to succeed, the liquidators would end up with much more money than the total of BCCI's liabilities when it collapsed. But it's likely to take years of expensive litigation before anything is resolved.
The American President-elect Bill Clinton has made 4 more appointments to his administration, including 3 women. There's growing speculation that the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Colin Powell, will become Secretary of State. Mr. Clinton's economic team was the first to be named.
With the US economy apparently beginning to pick up some strength, President-elect Clinton's key economic appointments were, he said, designed to appeal to Wall Street and Main Street. Political insiders, Congressman Leon Panetta as budget director, and former vice presidential candidate Senator Lloyd Bentsen as Treasury Secretary.
Our nation faces 2 deficits, a budget deficit and an investment deficit. I'm going to work my heart out with these people to construct a strong long-term plan for economic growth, for jobs, for incomes, and to reduce our national debt.
These challenges didn't develop overnight, and they won't be corrected overnight.
General Colin Powell, now chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, briefed and impressed the president-elect recently, leading to rumors he may be chosen as the new Secretary of State. Mr. Clinton would not be drawn.
I certainly think he's qualified to be Secretary of State. The answer to the second question is, I'll tell you who I'm considering for that position when I announce my appointment for Secretary of State.
Merry Christmas.
As President Bush lit the national Christmas tree for the last time, strong seasonal retail sales led some economists to assert Mr. Clinton inherits a healthier economy than he claimed during the election. But the president-elect argues the fundamental weaknesses remain, and the Clinton team is qualified to burst the political deadlock with Congress. Gavin Esler, BBC News, Washington.
The Prime Minister of India, Narasimha Rao, has denied any responsibility for the destruction of the historic mosque at Ayodhya. He's put the blame on the Hindu BJP movement, which controlled the state government. There's been more rioting in the capital, Delhi, but the overall level of violence has fallen sharply in the last 24 hours. It's now estimated that 1,000 people have been killed in the riots following the demolition of the mosque last Sunday. Here, British Rail is to give discounts to season ticket holders who've used lines that have failed to meet the standards laid down by the Passengers Charter. 25% of BR's routes failed to reach the required targets of punctuality and reliability.
It's 11 months since BR launched its passengers charter, and the record's better than many critics had predicted. But some commuters will receive a 5% discount when they renew their season tickets in January on various routes, including 5 intercity lines: the Gatwick Express service from London, the Anglia route from Norwich, the Midland Main Line to Sheffield, the main Glasgow to London service, and cross-country routes, including lines from Birmingham to Coventry and Bristol. Network South East Kent Coast service from London to Hastings and Dover is the only commuter line warranting a discount. Intercity says the figures show the results of underinvestment.
My worry is whether it's a level playing field or not. The routes with a modern investment, surprise, surprise, have come out best in the charter results. Those who are being starved of investment because of the current recession are coming out worst. Where we give the staff the tools, we get a very high target result.
The Transport Secretary says the failure of so many lines to reach their targets proves the standards set are high.
The conclusion must be that the Passengers Charter has its effects. It's good for passengers, it's good for British Rail in spurring them on to do better, and we can go on building on it.
Labour disagrees.
I think it's largely gimmickry. I think the vast majority of passengers would rather the sort of investment and commitment in a first-class railway that we want, instead of compensation for a railway that isn't really running as effectively as it should.
It's not yet clear how much compensation will cost BR. Its original estimate was £15 million, but for would-be private operators, seeing passengers being compensated for poor service is a stark reminder that the only thing harder than running a railway is running it at a profit.
The main news again at the European Summit in Scotland. EC leaders say they're close to agreement to enable Denmark to sign the Maastricht Treaty. On the Royal Yacht Britannia, the Queen and Duke of Edinburgh are hosting a dinner for the EC leaders attending the talks. The Prince and Princess of Wales are at the banquet, seated at separate tables. What's their first official engagement together since their separation was announced? That's it from the 9 o'clock news. Good night.
Good evening. West Yorkshire's Fire Authority is warning that new government spending restrictions could cost lives. The Chief Fire Officer says next year's budget is £4 million less than he needs to maintain minimum safety levels.
The West Yorkshire Fire Service has undergone a recruitment freeze for the past 2 years. Last year, cuts of £800,000 had to be made. This year, the authority says the spending restrictions are far worse.
If we've got to knock fire engines off the road, which is a possibility, someone will wait longer for a fire appliance, and if there's human life involved, obviously the dangers increase.
The Fire Authority says it will plead with the Home Office for more money. The alternative is no new recruits and a service below minimum standards.
5 members of the campaign group Women Against Pit Closures have occupied part of the Markham Main colliery in South Yorkshire, one of 10 pits facing closure in the new year. The group, which includes Anne Scargill, the wife of the NUM president, have locked themselves in a conference room to protest at the closure plan.
The 5 women arrived at Markham Main at 11 o'clock this morning. They walked into the colliery, taking British Coal officials completely by surprise, and occupied a conference room. British Coal evacuated and sealed off the building, but some miners were able to shout messages of support through office windows.
They're feeling high-spirited. I mean, what they've done has already been an achievement. The coal board are in a flap.
These men have done everything the government's asked. They've increased productivity, they've toed the line, and they're stabbed in the back. They can't fight. If they do anything, they'll lose their jobs. They're troublemakers, and so the women have got to do it, and I think that's sad.
Throughout the day, bouquets have arrived from across Britain, offering messages of support for the women, who say they're prepared to continue their protest for up to 3 days.
And that's it for me tonight. Now the national weather forecast from Michael Fish. Good night.
Good evening to you. Looks a little bit, I suppose, like the hills behind Crathley, but the real ones tomorrow, I think, may well have a covering of snow. But more about that in a minute. It's basically a changeable picture. One day rain, one day fine, another day of rain. Today we had the rain as that particular frontal system moved on south down across the country. Tomorrow a little bit of a ridge and then a new front for more rain on Sunday. Fair bit of cloud around at the moment, but it is beginning to clear away. There's also some rain on the radar and a scattering of showers in western Scotland, but both of them, as you see here on the computer, will be moving on, clearing the south coast during the latter part of the night. That is with the exception of the far southwest and the Channel Islands, and we're going to keep those wintry showers across the north. It's also quite breezy at the moment, a stiff northwesterly wind, but that too will die down in one or two sheltered spots like southeast Scotland, northeast England, East Anglia, and it is in those areas where that temperature might just about dip down to below freezing. And it's certainly going to be a colder night virtually everywhere, although still on the mild side in the extreme southwest there. But of course, with those temperatures dropping below freezing and the late rain, watch out for some icy patches on the road in the morning, and those wintry showers not helping things in the north of Scotland either. Little drizzle to end the night in the far southwest. That'll clear away, I think, first thing, and then for most parts it'll be a dry day, a reasonably bright one with a fair amount of sunshine. Still those wintry showers running across the north of Scotland, and there will be some cloud floating across every now and again over England and Wales as well, blotting out the sunshine, and a veil of cloud beginning to spill in from the west into Ireland in the second part of the day. But all eyes, of course, are on Scotland for tomorrow. First of all, for the wedding at Crathy. It's certainly going to be cold and windy, if nothing else. There might be the odd snow shower close by, but I think probably it's going to stay dry, as indeed it should do for the second day of the conference in Edinburgh, but there too cold and quite windy, and it's going to be a cold breezy day really countrywide. Temperatures at best around 7 or 8 degrees. Moving into Sunday, as we saw at the beginning, a new frontal system coming in from the west. It's going to be spreading rain across most parts of the country, that rain quite heavy in the north, preceded by snow over the mountains. Every chance it might brighten up though in the second part of the day in the east.
Hello, I'm here to bring you an urgent message about a quite phenomenal cluster of stars set to make a momentous appearance this weekend. Never glimpsed together before, these and many more of the biggest stars on the planet will be converging for the Royal Variety Performance and the Sports Review of the Year. You can observe them, without a telescope, by tuning into BBC1. That's the Royal Variety Performance, tomorrow at 7:15 p.m, and the Sports Review of the Year on Sunday at 7:45 p.m. Astronomically important viewing on BBC1.
Tonight on BBC Two, there's a tribute to the tennis star, coach and commentator Dan Maskell.